During a hunting trip with my son, he stole my gun and said, "You weak old man, you won't survive even a day out here." He abandoned me 47 kilometers from the road. When he returned home, I was already there with his gun in my hands. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. The morning air bit at my cheeks as I loaded my hunting rifle into Marcus's truck. At 60 years old, my joints protested the early hour, but I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. My son had actually called me, actually suggested we spend time together. After years of brief holiday visits and stilted phone conversations, Marcus wanted to go hunting with his old man. "You sure you can handle a full day out there, Dad?" Marcus asked, his tone carrying that familiar edge of condescension I'd grown used to over the years. He was 35 now, successful in his real estate business, always dressed in expensive clothes that made my worn flannel shirts look shabby by comparison. "I've been hunting these woods since before you were born," I replied, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "I think I can manage." Marcus just shrugged and started the engine. During the 40-minute drive to the remote hunting area, he talked mostly about his business deals, his new house, his wife's expensive tastes. I listened, hoping for some opening where I could connect with him, but everything he said seemed designed to remind me how much more successful he was than his father, who'd spent his life working construction and farming a small plot of land. When we reached the trailhead, Marcus insisted on carrying both our packs. "You just worry about keeping up," he said, with what I thought was affection, but now realize was something darker. The first few hours went well enough. We tracked deer signs, shared a thermos of coffee, and for brief moments, I almost felt like we were building something, father and son, the way it should be. Marcus even asked about my military service, something he'd never shown interest in before. "Tell me about Vietnam again," he said as we paused near a fallen log. "You never really talk about what happened over there." I was surprised by his interest, but pleased. "It was a different time," I started, settling onto the log. "Survival was everything. You learned to read the land, to trust your instincts, to stay alert, even when everything seemed peaceful." Marcus nodded, seeming genuinely engaged. "Sounds intense. Must have made you tough." "It changes you," I admitted. "But it also teaches you what really matters. Family, home, the simple things." That's when I should have noticed the change in his expression, the way his eyes went cold, calculating. But I was too caught up in the moment, too grateful for his attention. We'd been walking for about 3 hours when Marcus suggested we split up to cover more ground. "There's a clearing about a mile north," he said, pointing through the trees. "Why don't you head that way and I'll circle around from the east? We can meet back here in 2 hours. I hesitated. "You sure? This terrain can be tricky if you don't know it well." "Dad, I'm not a kid anymore. I can handle myself." His voice carried that sharp impatience I'd heard countless times over the years. "Besides, we'll cover twice as much ground this way." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I handed him my compass and extra water, keeping only what I thought I'd need for a short solo hunt. "Be careful," I called as he headed east. "These woods can fool you if you're not paying attention." He waved without looking back. I made my way through the dense undergrowth, following game trails I'd known since I was Marcus's age. The familiar rhythm of walking through the forest calmed me, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely peaceful. Maybe this trip would be the beginning of repairing our relationship. Maybe my son was finally ready to see me as more than just an obligation. I was tracking what looked like fresh deer sign when I heard Marcus's voice behind me. "Dad, I need your rifle for a minute." I turned, surprised. He was supposed to be a mile away. "What for? You have your own gun." "Mine's jammed. I think I can clear it, but I need a backup in case that buck we saw earlier comes back." His voice was casual, but something in his posture made me uneasy. He was standing too close, his hands restless at his sides. "Here, let me take a look at your rifle," I offered, reaching for his weapon. "I might be able to fix it." "No, Dad, just give me yours. Trust me." That word, trust, hit me like a physical blow. How many times had I given him everything he asked for, trusted his judgment, even when my instincts screamed otherwise? I'd trusted him when he'd asked for money for college, then for his business, then for his house down payment. I'd trusted him when he'd promised to pay me back, promises that had never materialized. But this felt different. This felt wrong. "Marcus, what's really going on here?" I kept my rifle secured across my chest, my finger instinctively moving toward the safety. Old military habits die hard. His mask slipped then. The pretense of filial affection vanished, replaced by something cold and hungry. "Just give me the damn gun, old man." When I didn't immediately comply, he lunged forward, grabbing for my rifle. We struggled briefly, but he was younger, stronger, and I was caught off guard by his aggression. The rifle slipped from my hands and Marcus stepped back, pointing it directly at my chest. "You weak old fool," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You really thought I wanted to spend time with you? You really thought this was some kind of father-son bonding trip?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "Marcus, what are you doing? Put the gun down." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what your problem is, Dad? You never knew when you were beaten. Always acting like you mattered, like your opinion counted for something, always in the way." "In the way of what?" "Everything. The land, the house, the life insurance. Do you have any idea how much you're worth dead? How much easier my life would be without you dragging me down with your pathetic existence?" The words hit me harder than any physical blow could have. This wasn't a momentary loss of temper or a hunting accident waiting to happen. This was planned, calculated. My own son had brought me out here to kill me. "You pathetic old man," Marcus continued, his voice growing more vicious with each word. "You never amounted to anything. A washed-up soldier, a failed farmer, a father who couldn't even keep his wife from leaving. You're weak, useless, and everyone knows it." He started backing away, keeping the rifle trained on me. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to leave you here, 47 kilometers from the nearest road. No compass, no extra water, no way to signal for help. Let's see how tough that military training really made you." I opened my mouth to speak, to reason with him, but he cut me off. "You won't survive one day out here, you weak old bastard. And when they find your body, if they ever do, it'll just be a tragic hunting accident. Dad got lost, couldn't find his way back. So sad. So preventable." He was moving steadily away now, taking both rifles with him. "Don't bother trying to follow me. I know these woods better than you think, and I'll be watching. If you try to head toward the road, I'll put a bullet in you and claim you were attacking me." The last thing I saw was his smile. Cold, satisfied, victorious. Then he disappeared into the trees, leaving me alone with nothing but the clothes on my back and the horrifying realization that my own son wanted me dead. I stood there for a long time after his footsteps faded, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The forest around me seemed suddenly hostile, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a possible danger. But underneath the shock and betrayal, something else was stirring. Something Marcus had clearly forgotten about his old man. I was a survivor, and I'd been underestimated before. The first thing you learn in combat is that panic kills faster than bullets. As I stood alone in the forest, watching the shadows where my son had disappeared, I felt the familiar ice-cold calm that had kept me alive in Vietnam settle over my mind. Marcus had made a critical error. He'd assumed that age had made me weak, that years of quiet farm life had erased the soldier I'd once been. He was wrong. I took inventory of what I had: a pocket knife, a lighter, the clothes on my back, and about half a bottle of water. Not much, but I'd survived on less. The afternoon sun was already beginning its descent, which meant I had maybe 4 hours of daylight left. Marcus expected me to panic, to wander aimlessly until exhaustion and exposure finished me off. Instead, I began to move with purpose. The old skills came back like muscle memory, reading the landscape, identifying landmarks, creating mental maps. I found a stream within the first hour, following it downstream because water always leads somewhere. As I walked, I gathered materials: dry bark for tinder, straight branches for tools, anything that might prove useful. My mind kept circling back to Marcus's words, the venom in his voice when he'd called me weak and useless. How long had he been planning this? How long had he looked at me and seen nothing but an obstacle to his inheritance? I thought about my ex-wife Sarah, who'd left when Marcus was 12. She'd said I was emotionally distant, that I couldn't connect with my family the way normal men did. Maybe she was right. Maybe I'd failed as a husband and father. But I'd never been weak, and I'd never been stupid. By evening, I'd found shelter in a natural overhang of rock near the stream. I built a small, smokeless fire and settled in to wait out the night. The temperature would drop significantly after midnight, but I'd prepared for that too. Layers of pine needles for insulation, a reflector wall of stones to direct heat, a supply of dry wood within arm's reach. As I sat by the fire, memories surfaced unbidden. Marcus at 8, crying because he'd fallen off his bike. Me teaching him to cast a fishing line at this very stream. Him graduating high school looking so proud in his cap and gown. When had it all gone wrong? When had love turned to resentment, and resentment to murderous hate? I dozed fitfully, waking every hour to tend the fire. Years of light sleeping in hostile territory had taught me to rest without losing awareness of my surroundings. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The distant sound of an engine. Marcus was coming back. I quickly scattered the fire and moved away from the shelter, positioning myself where I could observe without being seen. Sure enough, an ATV emerged from the tree line, its headlight cutting through the darkness. Marcus rode it slowly, methodically, searching for signs of my passage. He was checking to see if I'd died yet. I watched him stop near where he'd left me, playing his flashlight beam across the ground. Even from a distance, I could see his frustration when he found evidence that I'd moved, that I'd survived the first night. He spent 20 minutes searching before finally giving up and heading back the way he'd come. But not before I saw something that changed everything. He wasn't alone. There was a second person on the ATV behind him, someone I couldn't identify in the darkness. Marcus had an accomplice. After they left, I made my way back to my shelter and rebuilt the fire. The night felt colder now, not because of the temperature, but because of the implications of what I'd witnessed. This wasn't just about inheritance money or family resentment. This was bigger, more planned, more dangerous than I'd realized. The second day brought new challenges and new revelations. Following the stream, I found the remnants of an old logging road, overgrown but still passable. It led to an abandoned cabin, probably built by hunters or forestry workers decades ago. The roof leaked and the windows were broken, but the structure was sound. More importantly, it wasn't empty. Inside, I found evidence of recent occupation: sleeping bags, canned food, hunting equipment. Someone had been using this place regularly and recently. As I searched through the supplies, I found something that made my stomach turn. A folder containing papers with my name on them, life insurance documents, property deeds, a copy of my will from 2 years ago when I'd stupidly made Marcus my sole beneficiary. But there were other papers too, documents I'd never seen before. Medical reports claiming I'd been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. Psychiatric evaluations stating I was a danger to myself and others. All of them forgeries, but convincing ones. Marcus hadn't just planned to kill me. He'd been building a paper trail to explain my death, to make it look like a confused old man had wandered off into the woods and died of exposure. The medical documents would explain why no one had seen the signs, why he hadn't intervened sooner. Poor Marcus, dealing with his father's declining mental health, trying to be supportive while protecting himself from a potentially violent parent. It was elaborate, sophisticated, and absolutely terrifying in its thoroughness. I photographed everything with an old disposable camera I found among the supplies, then carefully put the documents back exactly as I'd found them. Marcus would be back to check on his staging area, and I couldn't let him know I'd discovered his real plan. As I continued exploring the cabin, I found something else that sent chills down my spine. A journal written in Marcus's handwriting, detailing his movements over the past 6 months. Visits to the cabin, meetings with someone identified only as D, preparations for the event. The most recent entry was dated 3 days ago. Final preparations complete. The old man still trusts me completely. This will be easier than we thought. There was definitely a partner in this scheme. I spent the rest of the day studying the journal, learning about my son's secret life. The cabin wasn't just a storage facility, it was a command center. Marcus and his accomplice had been using it to plan not just my murder, but what came after. The forged medical documents would be discovered among my papers at home. My will would be probated without challenge. Marcus would inherit everything, and no one would question the tragic loss of a mentally declining father. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated Robert Hayes, veteran of the Vietnam War, survivor of the Tet Offensive, holder of the Bronze Star for valor under fire. They thought 60 years old meant finished, helpless, ready to be discarded. They were about to learn otherwise. As darkness fell on my second night in the wilderness, I wasn't the confused, betrayed father who'd been abandoned the day before. I was something much more dangerous, a soldier with a mission. Marcus wanted to play predator and prey. Fine. But he was about to discover which one of us was really the hunter. I settled into the cabin for the night, keeping the fire small and hidden. Tomorrow, I would begin my own hunt. And unlike my son, I wouldn't be making any mistakes. On my third morning in the wilderness, I made a discovery that changed everything I thought I knew about my son's plan. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin's corner, I found a metal box containing documents that revealed the true scope of Marcus's betrayal. The first item that caught my attention was a detailed timeline spanning the past 18 months. It wasn't just about my death. It was about a systematic campaign to make me appear mentally unstable. Doctor visits I'd never made, documented in meticulous detail. Conversations with neighbors about my erratic behavior. Reports to Adult Protective Services about my supposed inability to care for myself. Marcus had been building a case against me for over a year, painting a picture of a deteriorating old man whose family was struggling to provide care and support. Every time he'd visited, every concerned phone call about my health, every suggestion that maybe I should consider assisted living, it had all been theater. But the most damning evidence was a series of photographs taken inside my own home. Pictures of my medicine cabinet, my financial documents, my daily routines. Someone had been in my house repeatedly, documenting everything, preparing for this moment. The violation felt more intimate than physical assault. As I studied the timeline, patterns emerged. Marcus's visits had increased dramatically after I'd updated my will 8 months ago, making him the sole beneficiary of my property and life insurance. That's when the Concerned Son Act had begun in earnest. That's when I'd started finding my medications rearranged, my mail opened and resealed, my food tasting slightly off on some mornings. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just planned to abandon me in the woods. He'd been slowly poisoning me. A second folder contained medical records showing elevated levels of various toxins in blood samples, allegedly taken from me during routine checkups. Samples I'd never given, at appointments I'd never attended. But the documentation was flawless, complete with forged signatures and false medical opinions about my declining cognitive function. I sat back on my heels, struggling to process the magnitude of what I was seeing. This wasn't a simple inheritance grab or a moment of desperate greed. This was a sophisticated long-term operation designed to destroy me systematically while making Marcus look like a devoted son dealing with his father's tragic decline. The third folder contained the most horrifying revelation of all: financial documents showing that Marcus was deeply in debt, not just credit cards or business loans, but serious money owed to people who didn't accept payment plans. The kind of debt that gets people killed if they don't settle it quickly. According to the paperwork, Marcus owed nearly $200,000 to various creditors, including some with addresses that meant nothing to me but felt dangerous even on paper. My life insurance policy was for exactly $250,000, enough to clear his debts with a comfortable margin left over. But there was something else in that financial folder that made my blood run cold. A contract. A business agreement between Marcus and someone named David Chen for specialized consulting services. in exchange for 40% of my life insurance payout. This David Chen wasn't just an accomplice, he was a hired professional. I'd been marked for death by a stranger who saw me as nothing more than a business transaction. The contract was dated 6 months ago, around the time Marcus had first suggested our hunting trip. This entire plan had been in motion for half a year, carefully orchestrated, methodically planned. Every family dinner, every phone call, every expression of concern had been part of the performance. I photographed everything using the disposable camera I'd found and a backup I discovered in another supply box. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed to be smart about how I used it. Marcus and this David Chen thought they were dealing with a confused old man stumbling around in the woods. They had no idea that their victim was systematically documenting their crime. Late that afternoon, I heard the sound of approaching engines again. This time, I was ready. I'd spent the day preparing observation points around the cabin, places where I could watch without being seen. When the two ATVs emerged from the tree line, I got my first clear look at Marcus's partner. David Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe late 20s, with the lean build and careful movements of someone comfortable with violence. He wore expensive outdoor gear and moved through the forest like he belonged there. This wasn't some desperate accomplice Marcus had recruited. This was a professional who'd done this before. I watched them methodically search the cabin, checking their supplies and discussing something in voices too low for me to hear clearly, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. They were confident, relaxed, certain that their plan was proceeding smoothly. Marcus pulled out what looked like a satellite phone and made a call. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see his satisfaction as he spoke. He was reporting in to someone, updating them on the progress of my elimination. After about 20 minutes, they prepared to leave. But before mounting their ATVs, David Chen did something that revealed the true nature of their operation. He pulled out a small electronic device and began scanning the area around the cabin, checking for surveillance equipment or tracking devices. This was a man who knew about law enforcement techniques, who understood how investigations worked. Marcus hadn't just hired muscle. He'd hired someone with expertise in making people disappear without leaving traces. As they rode away, I realized that staying ahead of them would require more than just survival skills. I was dealing with professionals who had resources, equipment, and experience. They expected me to die of exposure or get lost, trying to find my way out of the wilderness. They had contingency plans in case I survived longer than expected, but they didn't know about the metal box I'd found. They didn't know I'd discovered their timeline, their medical fraud, their financial desperation. Most importantly, they didn't know that the weak old man they'd left to die was now hunting them with the same methodical precision they'd used to plan my murder. That night I studied the contract again, memorizing every detail. David Chen's address was listed as a business office in the city, 40 minutes from my home. The payment schedule showed that Marcus had already made a down payment of $20,000, money he'd somehow scraped together despite being deeply in debt. Where had that money come from? The answer came to me with sickening clarity. He'd been stealing from me for months, probably years. Those times my bank statements didn't quite add up, when I'd attributed small discrepancies to my own carelessness or fading memory. It had all been Marcus, gradually draining my accounts to fund my own assassination. The betrayal cut deeper than the abandonment in the forest, deeper than the poisoning, deeper than the forged medical records. My son had been slowly, systematically destroying me from within my own home, all while playing the role of loving, concerned family. I closed the metal box and returned it to its hiding place, making sure everything looked undisturbed. Marcus and David would be back probably tomorrow to check on the status of their victim. They'd find the cabin exactly as they'd left it, no sign that anyone had discovered their secrets. But I wouldn't be the same man they'd left to die 3 days ago. I had information now, evidence, and most importantly, I had a plan. They wanted to play a game of predator and prey? Fine. But the roles were about to reverse in ways they couldn't imagine. As I prepared for my 4th night in the wilderness, I wasn't thinking about survival anymore. I was thinking about justice. And unlike my son and his hired killer, I had something they lacked: the moral certainty that comes from being the one who's been wronged. They'd made their choice when they decided I was worth more dead than alive. Now they were going to live with the consequences of underestimating a man who'd been counted out before and survived to tell about it. On the fourth day, I decided it was time to go home, not to surrender, not to seek help, but to turn the tables on my would-be killers. Marcus and David Chen expected me to either die in the wilderness or eventually stumble out, days later, confused and traumatized, with no memory of what had really happened. They were counting on exposure and exhaustion to cloud my thinking, to make me seem like the mentally declining old man their forged documents described. They were wrong on every count. Using the old logging roads and game trails I'd mapped over the past 3 days, I began my journey back to civilization. But I wasn't taking the direct route. Military training had taught me the value of unexpected approaches, and I had no intention of walking into another ambush. The trek took most of the day, following deer paths and abandoned forestry tracks that Marcus had probably forgotten existed. These were routes I'd learned as a young man, exploring the wilderness with my father before he passed away 30 years ago. Marcus had never shown interest in those family expeditions, preferring video games and television to tramping through the woods with his old man. His ignorance of the terrain was about to become my advantage. I reached the edge of my property as the sun was setting, approaching from the north side where thick pine trees provided cover almost to my back door. The house looked exactly as I'd left it 4 days ago, but something felt wrong. Lights were on in rooms that should have been dark, and there were 2 cars in my driveway, Marcus's BMW and an unfamiliar silver sedan that probably belonged to David Chen. They were inside my house. I crept closer, using the old shed and woodpile as cover, until I could see through my kitchen window. Marcus was sitting at my dining table, going through a stack of papers with methodical precision. David Chen stood nearby, occasionally glancing out the windows with the casual alertness of someone keeping watch. They were staging the scene of my disappearance. From my hidden position, I could see them planting evidence, placing the forged medical documents among my personal papers, positioning pill bottles to suggest medication confusion, even scattering some of my clothes on the floor to imply disorientation. They were creating the story that would be told after my body was eventually found in the wilderness. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a call. I couldn't hear the conversation, but his body language suggested he was reporting to someone in authority, probably calling the sheriff's department to report his father missing, expressing concern about my mental state, providing helpful background about my recent confusion and erratic behavior. The performance was flawless. To any investigating officer, Marcus would appear to be a loving son dealing with his father's tragic decline. The evidence in the house would support his story, and when my body was found, everything would make perfect sense. Except I wasn't dead, and I'd spent the last 4 days gathering evidence of their conspiracy. I watched them work for over an hour, cataloging every detail of their operation. David Chen was clearly the professional, directing Marcus's placement of evidence with the expertise of someone who'd done this before. He knew exactly how investigators would search the house, what they'd look for, what conclusions they'd draw. But professionals, in my experience, often became overconfident. They developed patterns, relied on methods that had worked before, and sometimes forgot that their opponents might be more resourceful than expected. Around 9 o'clock, they finished their work and prepared to leave. I heard Marcus on the phone again, this time speaking to what sounded like his wife. "No, Sarah, still no sign of him," he said, his voice heavy with false concern. "The sheriff's organizing a search party for tomorrow morning. I just pray we find him before." He let the sentence trail off, the unspoken implication clear. Poor Marcus, worried sick about his missing father, doing everything possible to bring him home safely. After they left, I waited another hour before approaching the house. Marcus had used his key to enter, but I could see that David had professionally swept for security cameras and alarm systems. They'd been thorough, but they'd missed something important: the spare key I kept hidden near the back porch, and the fact that I knew my own home better than any intruder ever could. I entered through the cellar door, using routes through my basement that avoided the main living areas where they might have placed surveillance equipment. The house felt violated, contaminated by their presence and their lies. Every room held evidence of their manipulation, from the scattered medications to the carefully positioned paperwork. But I had work to do before I could indulge in anger. Moving carefully through the house, I gathered the items I'd need for the confrontation I was planning. Most importantly, I retrieved Marcus's hunting rifle from where he'd hidden it in my bedroom closet. He'd brought it back here after abandoning me, probably planning to find it during the search and use it to support his story about my confused state of mind. Now it would serve a different purpose. I also collected the real evidence of their crime: bank statements showing the unauthorized withdrawals, medical appointment records proving I'd never received the treatments described in their forged documents, and most crucially, my personal journal, where I'd been documenting the strange symptoms I'd experienced over the past 8 months. Looking at those journal entries now, everything made sense. The nausea I'd attributed to aging, the occasional confusion I'd blamed on stress, the fatigue that seemed to come and go without reason, it had all been Marcus slowly poisoning me, testing dosages, preparing my body for the final act of his plan. I photographed everything with a digital camera I'd bought for documenting my property boundaries, building a comprehensive record of their conspiracy. Unlike the disposable cameras I'd used in the forest, these images would be admissible evidence, properly dated and stored. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the man my son had become. When had the child who'd cried when his goldfish died transformed into someone who could methodically plan his father's murder? When had family love been replaced by calculating greed? The answer, I realized, didn't matter anymore. Whatever Marcus had been in the past, whoever I'd hoped he might become, that person was gone. The man who'd abandoned me in the wilderness, who'd spent months poisoning me and forging medical records, who'd hired a professional killer to eliminate his own father, that was who Marcus really was. And he was about to learn that his old man was far from finished. I spent the rest of the night preparing for their return because I knew they'd be back. Marcus would want to be here when the search party found evidence of my disappearance. He'd want to play the grieving son, accepting condolences and sympathy while secretly celebrating his victory. But when he walked through that door tomorrow, he wouldn't find a crime scene staged for his benefit. He'd find something far more dangerous, a trap set by a man he'd underestimated for the last time. I positioned myself in the living room, where I'd have clear sight lines to all entrances, Marcus's rifle loaded and ready across my lap. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd intended this weapon to be evidence of my confusion and decline. Instead, it would be the instrument of his reckoning. As dawn approached, I heard vehicles in the distance, the sheriff's department organizing their search for the missing old man. Marcus would be with them, leading the effort to find his beloved father, providing helpful suggestions about where to look, sharing touching memories of their last conversation. He had no idea that the man he'd left to die was sitting in the family home, armed with his own weapon and ready to deliver a lesson in consequences that he'd never forget. The game was about to change, and for the first time in 4 days, I allowed myself to smile. Marcus wanted to see how weak his old man really was. He was about to find out that some lessons can only be learned the hard way. I heard Marcus's BMW pull into the driveway at exactly 10:30 in the morning. Through the living room window, I watched him park and sit for a moment, composing himself for the performance he was about to give. He checked his appearance in the rearview mirror, practiced an expression of worried concern, then stepped out of the car with the measured movements of a man carrying a heavy emotional burden. The search party had been combing the woods for 3 hours. I'd listened to their radio chatter on my old emergency scanner, hearing Marcus's voice periodically offering suggestions, sharing fabricated details about my recent confusion and tendency to wander. He was playing his role perfectly, the devoted son desperately hoping for his father's safe return. He used his key to enter through the front door, calling out as he stepped inside. "Dad? Dad, are you here? Please, if you can hear me, just say something." I let him take 3 steps into the living room before I spoke. "Hello, Marcus." He froze like a deer caught in headlights, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and finally terror, as he saw me sitting in my recliner with his hunting rifle pointed directly at his chest. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the distant voices of the search party, still looking for a man who was very much alive and extremely well-informed. "Dad?" His voice cracked like a teenager's. Where have you been?" "We've been looking everywhere for you." I studied his face, looking for any trace of the son I'd once loved, any flicker of genuine emotion beneath the calculated performance. I found nothing but fear and rapidly calculating eyes, trying to figure out how to salvage his plan. "Sit down, Marcus. We need to talk." He remained standing, his hands raised slightly as if to show he meant no harm. "Dad, you're scaring me." "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "Let me call the sheriff. Tell them you're safe." I said, "Sit down." The authority in my voice was something he'd never heard before, the tone I'd used with soldiers under my command 40 years ago. It cut through his pretense like a blade, and he slowly lowered himself onto the couch across from me, never taking his eyes off the rifle. "You know, Marcus, I've had 4 days to think about what happened in those woods. 4 days to consider why my own son would steal my weapon and abandon me 47 kilometers from civilization. 4 days to remember things that didn't make sense at the time." His mouth opened, but I continued before he could speak. Like why my food has been tasting strange on some mornings, why my medications keep getting rearranged in ways I don't remember, why you've been so interested in my will lately, so concerned about my health, so eager to spend time with your old man after years of barely tolerating my existence. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized I wasn't the confused, traumatized victim he'd expected to find. I was alert, focused, and very much in control of the situation. "Dad, I don't know what you think happened, but I found the cabin, Marcus." Those 5 words hit him like physical blows. His carefully constructed facade cracked completely, revealing the desperate, trapped animal underneath. He started to stand, but I shifted the rifle slightly, and he sank back onto the couch. "I found your supplies, your timeline, your forged medical records, your contract with David Chen." I let each revelation sink in, watching his face grow paler with every word. "I know about the poisoning. I know about the debt. I know exactly how much my life is worth to you." He was shaking now, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the couch. "You don't understand the situation I'm in. I owe money to people who don't accept excuses. They threatened Sarah, threatened the kids. I had no choice." "You had choices, Marcus. You could have asked for help. You could have filed for bankruptcy. You could have told me the truth about your debts instead of trying to murder me for the insurance money." "It wasn't supposed to be murder." The words burst out of him like a confession he'd been holding back. "You were supposed to get lost, maybe get hypothermia." "It would have looked like an accident. No one would have gotten hurt except—" He stopped himself, but the damage was done. "Except me," I finished for him. "Your father, who worked his whole life to give you opportunities I never had, who paid for your education, helped with your house down payment, supported your business when it was struggling, the man who loved you despite your selfishness, your cruelty, your complete inability to see anyone but yourself as fully human." Tears were streaming down his face now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of fear, of a trapped predator realizing his prey had become the hunter. "I prepared something for you, Marcus," I said, my voice steady and calm. "While you've been out there playing the grieving son, searching for your poor, confused father, I've been gathering evidence. Every document you forged, every transaction you made, every conversation you had with your hired killer, it's all documented now." I reached beside my chair and pulled out a thick folder, setting it on the coffee table between us. "Bank records showing your unauthorized access to my accounts. Medical records proving I never received the treatments described in your fabricated reports. Photographs of your timeline, your contract, your entire conspiracy." his eyes fixed on the folder like it contained his death sentence, which, in a very real sense, it did. You know what the most interesting part is? I continued. The pattern of small withdrawals from my account over the past 18 months. Always just under the reporting threshold. Always timed to coincide with your visits. You've been stealing from me for over a year, funding your gambling debts and your murder plot with my own money. Please, Dad, just listen. No, Marcus, you listen. For 35 years, I listened to your lies, your excuses, your promises to do better. I listened when you said you'd pay back the money I lent you. I listened when you said you were grateful for everything I'd done. I listened when you said you loved me. I leaned forward slightly, keeping the rifle trained on his chest. But I'm done listening to lies. Now you're going to tell me the truth. All of it. How long you've been planning this. How you recruited David Chen. What you've done with the money you stole. Every detail of your conspiracy to murder your own father. He was hyperventilating now, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I can't. If I tell you everything, they'll kill me. The people I owe money to, they don't forgive debts. They don't accept partial payments. That's your problem to solve, not mine. But you're going to solve it without murdering me for the insurance money. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, setting it on the table next to the evidence folder. You're going to confess everything, right here, right now. Every crime, every lie, every betrayal. And you're going to do it because the alternative is much worse. His eyes darted around the room, looking for escape routes, weapons, anything that might give him an advantage. But he was an amateur dealing with a professional, a spoiled child facing a combat veteran who'd survived real predators in real jungles. What alternative? He whispered. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I could kill you right here, right now, with your own rifle. Self-defense against a disturbed son who came to finish what he started in the woods. I have 4 days of evidence showing your intent to murder me. Any jury would see it as justified. The silence stretched between us, filled only by his ragged breathing and the distant sounds of the search party still looking for a missing man who was very much present and in complete control. Or, I continued, you can confess everything. Help me expose David Chen and whatever organization he represents, and take your chances with the legal system. Prison might be safer than the streets for a man with your kind of debts. I reached over and pressed the record button on the device. Your choice, Marcus, but choose quickly. That search party is going to want to know why their missing person is sitting in his living room with a rifle instead of wandering confused through the wilderness. He stared at the recorder for a long moment, then at the evidence folder, then at the rifle pointed at his heart. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My name is Marcus Hayes, and I tried to kill my father. For the next hour, he told me everything. The gambling debts that had spiraled out of control, the loan sharks who'd given him an ultimatum, his research into professional killers, leading him to David Chen. The months of preparation, forging documents, stealing money, gradually poisoning me to support the narrative of declining health. By the time he finished, I had a complete confession and enough evidence to destroy not just him, but the entire network of criminals he'd become involved with. The scared, desperate man sitting across from me bore no resemblance to the son I'd once loved, but he was telling the truth for the first time in years, and that truth was going to set both of us free, though not in ways he could have imagined. 2 hours after Marcus finished his confession, Sheriff Davidson arrived at my house with the search and rescue team. I met them at the front door, looking appropriately disheveled for a man who'd been lost in the wilderness for 4 days, but alert enough to convince them I was unharmed and coherent. Robert, thank God you're safe, Sheriff Davidson said, genuine relief in his voice. Your son has been worried sick. Where have you been? I glanced over his shoulder at Marcus, who stood frozen by his car, watching our interaction with the desperate intensity of a man whose entire future hung in the balance. I got turned around in the woods, I said, keeping my voice steady but slightly shaky, like a man who'd been through an ordeal. Found an old cabin, waited for the weather to clear, lost track of time. It was technically true, though it omitted the crucial details about why I'd gotten lost and what I'd discovered while I was gone. The sheriff didn't need to know about Marcus's confession yet. That revelation would come later, in a more controlled setting, where I could ensure maximum impact. "We should get you checked out at the hospital," Davidson suggested. 4 days in the wilderness at your age? Even if you found shelter." "I'm fine, Sheriff. Just tired and hungry. What I really need is a hot meal and my own bed." Marcus stepped forward then, playing his role one last time. "Dad, I was so scared. When you didn't come back from the woods, when we couldn't find any trace of you." His voice broke convincingly, though I could see the cold calculation behind his tears. "I'm sorry, son. I didn't mean to worry you." The words tasted like poison in my mouth, but they were necessary. Marcus needed to believe his secret was safe, that his confused old father had no memory of being abandoned or any understanding of what had really happened. The longer he felt secure, the more careless he'd become. After the search team departed and the sheriff finished his report, Marcus and I were alone again. He sat heavily in the kitchen chair, relief evident in every line of his body. He thought he'd won, that his plan had worked despite the unexpected complication of my survival. "I'm glad you're okay, Dad," he said. And for a moment, he almost sounded like he meant it. "When you disappeared like that, I thought I might never see you again." I nodded, pouring myself a cup of coffee with deliberately shaky hands. It was scary out there. I kept thinking about our hunting trip, trying to remember which direction we'd come from. Everything looked the same after a while. "You don't remember what happened? How we got separated?" I could hear the careful probing in his question, the need to know exactly how much I recalled. "It's all fuzzy," I said, which was another technical truth. "I remember you saying something about splitting up and then, I don't know. I must have gotten confused, taken a wrong turn somewhere." "Yeah." The relief that washed over his face was unmistakable. He thought he was in the clear, that his mentally declining father had no memory of the attempted murder or the abandonment. He began to relax, to slip back into the performance of being a caring son. Over the next week, I watched him carefully, documenting his behavior and building my case. He visited daily, bringing groceries and checking on my health with what anyone else would have seen as loving concern. But I could see the calculation behind every gesture, the way he monitored my medications and asked carefully worded questions about my memory. He was still planning to kill me. The wilderness gambit had failed, but Marcus wasn't the type to give up easily. He just needed a new approach, one that wouldn't depend on my conveniently getting lost in the forest. On Thursday evening, 8 days after my return, Marcus arrived for dinner carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the smile I'd once thought meant affection, but now recognized as predatory satisfaction. "I thought we should celebrate," he said, uncorking the wine with practiced ease. "You surviving that ordeal, us having another chance to spend time together. Family is precious, Dad. I don't want to take it for granted anymore." I accepted the glass he offered, noting how he made sure I saw him pour from the same bottle, eliminating any suspicion about the contents. But I also noticed how he positioned himself between me and the kitchen, how his free hand rested casually near the knife block, how his eyes never quite met mine when he spoke about family and second chances. "You know, Marcus," I said, settling into my recliner with the wine, "I've been thinking about that hunting trip. Bits and pieces are starting to come back to me." He went very still, his glass halfway to his lips. "What kind of bits and pieces?" "Fragments, mostly. I remember you taking my rifle, saying something about yours being jammed. I remember walking for a long time, feeling confused about which direction to go." I took a small sip of the wine, watching his face over the rim. "I keep having this strange feeling that something important happened, something I should remember but can't quite grasp." "Now, Marcus set down his glass and leaned forward, his voice gentle but urgent. "Dad, the doctor said memory issues are normal after trauma. Sometimes it's better not to force these things. The important thing is that you're safe now." "You're probably right," I agreed, then stood up slowly. "I think I need to use the bathroom. This old bladder isn't what it used to be." I left him alone in the living room for exactly 3 minutes, long enough for him to do what I knew he would do. When I returned, he was sitting exactly where I'd left him, but my wine glass had been moved slightly, and there was a faint residue of powder near the base that hadn't been there before. So that was his new plan. Drug me until I lost consciousness, then stage an accident, maybe a fall down the stairs or a slip in the bathtub, something that would look natural for a confused elderly man still recovering from his ordeal in the wilderness. I picked up my glass and pretended to drink, letting a small amount of the contaminated wine touch my lips but not swallowing. "You know what, Marcus? I'm feeling a bit dizzy all of a sudden. Maybe I should sit down." His eyes sharpened with interest, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of concern. "Are you okay? Should I call a doctor?" No, just tired, I think. The stress of everything catching up with me." I made a show of struggling to stay upright, then slowly lowered myself back into the recliner. "Could you get me a glass of water? Maybe some of those pills Dr. Morrison prescribed for the anxiety." "Of course, Dad. Just rest. I'll take care of everything." He hurried toward the kitchen, and I knew he was going to get the anxiety medication that would complement whatever he'd put in the wine. A perfect combination that would make my death look like an accidental overdose by a confused man dealing with trauma. While he was gone, I quickly dumped the contaminated wine into the potted plant beside my chair and replaced it with water from the glass I'd prepared earlier. When Marcus returned with the pills and fresh water, I was slumped in the chair with my eyes closed, breathing slowly and deeply. "Dad, how are you feeling?" I opened my eyes with apparent effort, blinking slowly as if struggling to focus. "Better, I think. Just so tired, everything feels heavy." He held out the pills with a smile that was probably meant to look compassionate, but came across as hungry. "Take these. They'll help you relax." "I trust you, son," I said, accepting the pills, but palming them instead of swallowing. "You've always looked out for me." For the next hour, I performed the role of a man slowly succumbing to drugged unconsciousness. I let my speech become slurred, my movements unsteady, my eyelids heavy. Marcus watched every symptom with barely concealed anticipation, occasionally checking my pulse and breathing like a doctor, monitoring a patient's decline. When I finally pretended to lose consciousness completely, he waited another 20 minutes before moving. Then he began to set up his final scene, positioning my body to suggest I'd fallen asleep in the chair and simply never woken up. An old man, overcome by medication and stress, passing peacefully in his sleep. It might have worked too if I hadn't been recording everything. When he leaned over to check my pulse one final time, I opened my eyes and spoke clearly into the silence. "I prepared something for you, Marcus." The shock on his face was absolute, primitive terror of a predator realizing he'd become the prey. Before he could react, I reached under my chair and produced his hunting rifle, the same weapon he'd used to threaten me in the forest. "Sit down, son. We need to finish our conversation." This time, there was no performance, no pretense of family affection. Marcus collapsed onto the couch like a marionette with cut strings, staring at me with the hollow eyes of a man who'd finally been caught. "How?" was all he managed to whisper. "I never lost consciousness. I never took your pills. I never forgot what you did to me in those woods." I gestured toward the hidden camera I'd installed earlier that week. "And I've been recording everything since you arrived tonight." The next morning, Sheriff Davidson returned to my house, this time with a warrant and a team of investigators. The evidence I provided was overwhelming. Marcus's recorded confession, documentation of his financial crimes, proof of the systematic poisoning, and video evidence of his attempt to drug me the night before. David Chen was arrested 3 hours later at his business office, caught completely off guard by the speed and thoroughness of the investigation. The contract in his possession matched the one I'd found in the forest cabin, and his client list revealed a disturbing pattern of suspicious deaths among elderly clients. Marcus was charged with attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. His wife filed for divorce within the week, taking their children and disappearing into witness protection after revealing additional details about his criminal associations. As for me, I sold the house and most of my possessions, keeping only what I needed for a new life. The insurance money that Marcus had coveted went to establish a trust fund for my grandchildren, ensuring they'd have opportunities their father had forfeited through his choices. I moved to a small cabin in Montana, far from the memories and the pain of betrayal. The isolation that had once seemed like punishment now felt like peace. I had no family left, but I'd learned that blood relations don't guarantee love, and love doesn't require blood. On quiet evenings sitting on my porch watching the sunset over the mountains, I sometimes thought about the son I'd lost long before he tried to kill me. Not the murderer who'd been sentenced to 25 years in prison, but the child who'd once trusted me to protect him from monsters. I'd failed to see that the real monster was growing up inside my own house, fed by indulgence and unchecked by consequences. But in the end, I'd kept my promise to protect my family, even if it meant protecting them from one of their own. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Marcus learned that underestimating someone because of their age is a dangerous mistake. I learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. And in the silence of my mountain retreat, surrounded by the honest challenges of wilderness survival rather than the calculated cruelties of human betrayal, I finally found the peace that had eluded me for 60 years. The predator had become the prey, just as he'd planned. He just hadn't realized which one of us was which.